Is Belize independent or Guatemalan? Welcome back to World History Explored. I'm your host, Adam Zane. Picture this. You're looking at a world map, and there's Belize, a small country on the Caribbean coast of Central America. It has its own flag, government, and has been independent since 1981. Case closed, right? Not so fast. For nearly 2 centuries, Guatemala has claimed that over half of Belize actually belongs to them. And this isn't just some dusty historical footnote. Right now, as we speak, both countries are battling it out at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Today, we're diving into one of the world's most fascinating territorial disputes, a story that spans conquistadors and British pirates, colonial treaties, and modern diplomacy. When colonial powers draw lines on maps, who really owns the land? So grab your coffee. We're about to explore how history refuses to stay buried. The colonial scramble, 1500s to 1800s. Our story begins in 1502 when Christopher Columbus sailed along what we now call the Belize coast during his final voyage to the Americas. Spain immediately claimed the entire region, but here's the thing. They never really settled it. While Spain built magnificent cities like Antigua, Guatemala, and established vast haciendas across Mexico, the Belize coast remained largely untouched. Dense jungle, swampy coastlines, and fierce Maya resistance made it a nightmare for Spanish colonists. The Maya had built sophisticated cities like Caracol and weren't about to give up their homeland without a fight. So Spain did what colonial powers often did with difficult territories: claimed them on paper and largely ignored them in practice. Enter the British pirates. Throughout the 1600s, British buccaneers used Belize's countless cays and inlets as bases for attacking Spanish treasure ships. But by the mid-1600s, some discovered something more profitable than piracy: logwood. This tree produced a deep red dye crucial for Europe's textile industry, literally worth its weight in silver. These British settlers became known as baymen, after the Bay of Honduras. Using enslaved African labor, they ventured into swampy forests, cut trees, and dragged heavy logs to the coast. It was dangerous, deadly work, but the profits were enormous. By the 1700s, mahogany became even more valuable. Spain watched with growing frustration. These British settlers were trespassing on Spanish territory, cutting Spanish trees, and making fortunes from Spanish resources. But Spain couldn't stop it. They were stretched thin across a vast empire and had bigger problems than a few hundred loggers in remote swamps. Instead, Spain tried diplomacy. Throughout the 1700s, they signed treaty after treaty with Britain: the 1763 Treaty of Paris, the 1783 Treaty of Versailles, the 1786 Convention of London. Each had the same theme. Spain kept official sovereignty, but granted Britain specific logging rights in designated areas. But the baymen were terrible at following rules. These weren't diplomats. They were rough frontiersmen who consistently pushed beyond treaty boundaries and treated the entire coast as their domain. Tensions exploded on September 10, 1798, at the Battle of St. George's Caye. Spain assembled over 30 ships carrying 2,000 soldiers to end British occupation once and for all. But the baymen were ready. Led by British officials and supported by a diverse fighting force, British settlers, free men of color, enslaved Africans fighting for freedom, and Maya allies, they repelled the Spanish fleet using their knowledge of every reef and sandbar. Spain never returned. September 10th is still celebrated as Belize's National Day. Not Independence Day, but the day their survival was secured. Legally, though, Spain never gave up their claims. This fiction lasted until the 1820s, when Spain's American empire collapsed. Newly independent Guatemala declared they had inherited all Spanish territorial claims, including the troublesome British settlement to the east. And that's where our modern dispute begins. The treaty that started it all, 1859. By the 1850s, this situation had become diplomatically embarrassing. Britain controlled Belize in practice, with governors, laws, and functioning institutions. Guatemala claimed it on paper. Ships couldn't be sure if they were in British or Guatemalan waters. Something had to give. The breakthrough came in 1859, when Britain and Guatemala signed the Waikalkina Treaty. just 7 articles, but it would generate decades of controversy. Here's the interpretive nightmare. Both countries have completely different understandings of what this treaty accomplished. Britain's view: this was a straightforward boundary agreement. The treaty drew clear lines using specific geographical features: rivers, ridges, natural landmarks. Article 7 mentioned Britain would help build a road from Guatemala City to the Caribbean coast, but this was just a friendly gesture to help Guatemala access shipping routes. Guatemala's view: this wasn't a boundary agreement, it was a land sale. Guatemala agreed to transfer territory to Britain in exchange for Britain building that Caribbean road. The road wasn't a bonus, it was the entire reason Guatemala was willing to give up valuable territory they couldn't actually enforce anyway. From Guatemala's perspective, this made perfect sense. They'd been landlocked since independence, forced to ship exports through foreign ports. A direct Caribbean road would have been economically transformative. But here's the problem that haunts this dispute. The road was never built. Britain conducted surveys and began limited construction, but the challenges were overwhelming. Dense jungle, steep mountains, unbridged rivers, seasonal flooding. Cost estimates kept rising, and Britain eventually abandoned the project. Guatemala was furious. From their perspective, Britain had entered a contract, territory for infrastructure. When Britain failed to deliver, Guatemala considered the entire contract void. This disagreement simmered until the 1940s, when Guatemala officially declared the treaty null and demanded Belize back. But Guatemala's position was complicated by their own actions. In 1931, Britain and Guatemala exchanged diplomatic notes about placing boundary markers along their border. Guatemalan officials actively participated, providing guides, workers, and formally acknowledging the completed markers. Think about this contradiction. Guatemala spent years arguing the border was invalid, then helped mark that very border on the ground. In legal terms, this looks like acquiescence, accepting a situation through actions even while disputing it in words. The fight for independence, 1960s to 1981. By the 1960s, colonies worldwide were gaining independence. British Honduras wanted to join them. In 1964, Britain granted self-government. In 1973, the name changed to Belize, signaling intention for full independence. Guatemala was furious. Their position was simple: Belize couldn't become independent because it was stolen Guatemalan territory. They backed this up with troop mobilizations and threatening statements about recovering their lost territory. For tiny Belize, with only 150,000 people, this was terrifying. Faced with potential invasion, Belize launched one of history's most successful diplomatic campaigns. Their strategy was genius: reframe the dispute from a historical border question into a moral issue about self-determination. Belizean leaders argued this wasn't about colonial treaties, it was about the fundamental right of people to choose their own government. The residents of Belize had lived there for generations, developed their own culture and institutions. No outside power should impose a different government against their will. This argument was perfectly calibrated for the 1970s international politics. Both Cold War sides paid lip service to self-determination principles. The decolonization movement had created powerful international consensus that people should choose their own governments. Belize took this message everywhere: the UN, the non-aligned movement, Caribbean forums. The campaign was led by diplomats like Assad Shoman, who understood Belize couldn't win militarily, but might win the battle for international opinion. The breakthrough came when Cuba supported Belize. You'd think Cuba would automatically back Guatemala, but they saw this as a small, multiracial society threatened by a larger, military-dominated neighbor. Cuban support gave Belize credibility within the non-aligned movement. The campaign climaxed in 1980, when the UN General Assembly voted 139-0 for Resolution 35/20, demanding Belize's independence with all its territory intact. Even Guatemala's traditional allies voted for Belize. Britain responded to continued Guatemalan threats by reinforcing their military presence: Harrier jets, helicopters, thousands of professional soldiers. The message was clear: invasion would mean war with Britain. On September 21st, 1981, Belize declared independence with Princess Margaret attending the ceremony. George Price became the first prime minister. It was a triumph of diplomacy over military threat. But Guatemala refused recognition until 1991, 10 years where Belize existed in diplomatic limbo, independent to the world, but not to its closest neighbor. Recognition, but not resolution, 1991 to present. When Guatemala finally recognized Belize in 1991, they were careful. They recognized Belize's independence, not its borders. Their position became, fine, you can be a country, but you're sitting on our land. Guatemala claims 53% of Belize's territory, everything south of the Sibon River. We're talking about an area larger than Jamaica, including Belize's most fertile land, tourist destinations like Placencia, oil reserves, and portions of the world's second-largest barrier reef. This creates real problems. Guatemalan farmers and loggers regularly cross into disputed territory they consider rightfully theirs. Fishing disputes arise over unclear maritime boundaries. Drug traffickers exploit border confusion. Tourism suffers from uncertainty and security concerns. The 2019 murder of Guatemalan peasant leader Maximo Cal in disputed territory created a diplomatic crisis, demonstrating how abstract legal disputes can have fatal consequences. For Belizeans, the territorial dispute creates constant anxiety about their country's future. Every government must balance desires for normal relations with Guatemala against protecting territorial integrity. Domestic politics in both countries make negotiated settlements nearly impossible. Any Belizean politician agreeing to give up territory would face accusations of betraying independence. Any Guatemalan politician abandoning territorial claims would be accused of surrendering national birthright. Taking it to court, 2008 to present. After decades of failed negotiations, both countries agreed in 2008 to submit their dispute to the International Court of Justice, but only if their citizens approved through referendums. Guatemala's referendum in 2018 was overwhelming. 95.9% supported the ICJ option. Guatemalans were confident international law would validate their historical claims. Belize's 2019 referendum was much closer, 55.4% in favor, revealing deep societal divisions. Opponents argued going to court was unnecessary and dangerous. Why risk existing recognition? Supporters contended it was the only way to permanently resolve uncertainty. Since 2019, both countries have submitted thousands of pages to the ICJ. The written phase ended in 2023. Oral hearings are expected soon. Belize's case rests on 4 pillars. The 1859 treaty was a valid boundary agreement. 160 years of effective occupation matters. Self-determination is fundamental. Guatemala's 1991 recognition constitutes legal acquiescence. Guatemala argues the 1859 treaty was a conditional agreement voided when Britain failed to build the road. They inherited Spain's legitimate colonial claims. Recognition of independence didn't mean accepting borders. Historically, the ICJ prefers maintaining existing borders for regional stability, suggesting Belize has advantages. But territorial disputes involve complex historical and legal questions that make predictions difficult. The reality today. Whatever the ICJ decides, one thing is crystal clear. Belize is independent and functioning as a fully sovereign state. The evidence is everywhere. Their own flag, constitution, military, passport, currency, laws, elections. They're UN members with the same rights as any country. Even Guatemala maintains a full embassy in Belize City. The ICJ case isn't about whether Belize exists. That was settled in 1981. It's about the exact location of the border between 2 sovereign states. Even if Guatemala won, modern international law makes forcible territorial transfer extremely difficult, especially when affected populations object. The disputed areas are populated by people who consider themselves Belizean, live under Belizean law, and have repeatedly expressed preference for remaining part of Belize. The practical challenges would be enormous. These areas are economically, socially, and infrastructurally integrated with Belize. Schools teach Belizean curriculum in English. Legal systems apply common law. Business networks and family connections run north-south within Belize, not toward Guatemala. The international community will watch carefully, not just for immediate impact, but for what it says about resolving 21st-century territorial disputes. The case involves fundamental questions about historical claims versus current realities, legal rights versus practical governance, state sovereignty versus popular self-determination. Conclusion. So, is Belize independent or Guatemalan? The answer is unambiguous. Belize is independent. It has been since 1981, and no court ruling will change that fundamental reality. What the International Court of Justice will decide is more specific: where exactly the border runs between these neighbors. This dispute perfectly illustrates how colonial history continues shaping our modern world. Treaties signed by European powers centuries ago still determine the fate of nations today. For Belize, independence was hard-won through brilliant diplomacy and international solidarity. The fight for secure, undisputed borders continues, but their right to exist as a sovereign nation was established over 4 decades ago and reaffirmed daily through democratic participation of their citizens. The ICJ's eventual ruling will either finally put this dispute to rest or create new complications we can't yet imagine. Either way, it will be a defining moment for both countries and a significant precedent for how territorial disputes are resolved in our interconnected world. What do you think? Will the International Court of Justice side with Belize's self-determination argument or Guatemala's historical claims? Should small nations like Belize have to constantly defend borders that the whole world recognizes? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the world's most fascinating territorial disputes, hit that like button and subscribe to World History Explored for more stories about how the past shapes our present. Until next time, keep exploring history because as we've seen today, it's never really over.